I want to thank you again for joining us in another study of the book of Isaiah. I'll ask, if you will, to please be turning to chapter 34 as we're moving toward the end of this first major section. Chapters 1 through 35 of the book of Isaiah have comprised this first concept, this first major topic. Then in chapters 36 through 39, we're going to see a little historic interlude, or a bridge, if you will, into the next major section. And chapters 36 through 39 are going to deal with Hezekiah. As we close out this session, we see verse 34, chapter 34 is a chapter of judgment, primarily against Edom, singled out. And then chapter 35 is going to be more upbeat. It's going to refer more to the hope of God's people. So let's look at these two chapters. Not as much detail as in other chapters that we've seen, but let's look at these two chapters and prepare ourselves for moving on to that next section. Here, we see the contrast of results of God's judgment on the nations. Those who rejected God's will, those who rejected God's purposes are going to suffer defeat. That's chapter 34. But his people would be redeemed and they would rejoice. That's chapter 35. Edom is singled out in this chapter, but only as a representation of all of the nations upon whom God is going to bring judgment. In other words, he's not saying Edom is the only one that's going to suffer this fate, but Edom is referenced here as that lone representative of a much larger group of nations. They were hostile to God's and to God's people. Remember that the hatred, the enmity between Edom and Judah goes all the way back to Jacob and Esau. We see that portrayed largely in Numbers chapter 20, verses 14 through 21. And that became a pattern for centuries, the behavior between the two. So let's go ahead and look, first of all, really this entire chapter is going to be God's sword that's going to descend for judgment. But first of all, let's look at verses 1 through 4. Come near, you nations, to hear and heed, you people. Let the earth hear, and all that is in it, the world and all things that come forth from it. For the indignation of the Lord is against all nations, and his fury against all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to the slaughter. Also their slain shall be thrown out, their stench shall rise from their corpses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. All the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. All their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine, and as fruit falling from a fig tree. Here we see the picture Isaiah is drawing here of God drawing all these nations together for the judgment that he was pronouncing against these evil nations. Now, numerous details here are provided about their fate, and we're not going to get into those details, but I am going to mention a couple of other passages that use the same type language in a very similar situation. For example, both Matthew chapter 24 and verse 29 and Revelation chapter 6 verses 13 and 14 reflect the very same imagery that we see in verse 4 of this text there. Let's just zero in on Matthew 24 for just a moment. You might remember that being the chapter where Christ deals with two different lines of thought. There were questions that were asked. In the first part of the chapter, he's dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. In the latter part of the chapter, from verse 36 on, he's dealing with the second coming of Christ. And so here, though, we want to zero in on that concept of Jerusalem and the judgment that is going to come. That's all going to occur about 70 AD. So you're seeing very figurative language, that highly figurative language that is used to describe the destruction that is going to be seen in that context here. God, through Isaiah, is drawing a picture of judgment against those countries, specifically Edom here, that had mistreated and attacked and abused. God's people. Now verses 5 through 7. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven, indeed it shall come down on Edom, and on the people of my curse for judgment. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood, it is made overflowing with fatness, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. The wild oxen shall come down with them, and the young bulls with the mighty bulls. Their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust saturated with fatness. Again, this is one of the reasons that we see people who often have a dislike for the Old Testament. And that is because of the harsh language that is often used. It's bloody, it's gory. But it's language that man will understand, especially people who have been involved in warfare for some time, to see the language that is used often reflected on the battlefield. And as people do horrific things to other people, well, God's judgment is portrayed in that same way. And as it relates to Edom and these other nations, you're looking at those nations that meted out that kind of punishment to others. And now they're going to receive it in kind as God brings his punishment against them. There you've got details regarding the penalty due to Edom. God's sword literally is going to be covered. It's going to be dripping with their blood. Interesting there, the language is very similar to what's being described here with the knives that the priests used as it related to preparing the sacrifices and the bloody nature of the sacrifices that were offered. It's quite a graphic picture that is being presented. The sacrifice is indeed going to be great in Bozrah, is what he's saying. Now verses 8 through 15. For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, the year of recompense for the cause of Zion. Its streams shall be turned into pitch, and its dust into brimstone. Its land shall become burning pitch. It shall not be quenched night or day. Its smoke shall ascend forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste. No one shall pass through it forever and ever, but the pelican and the porcupine shall possess it. Also the owl and the raven shall dwell in it, and he shall stretch out over it the line of confusion and the stones of emptiness. They shall call its nobles to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and all its princes shall be as nothing. And thorns shall come up in its palaces, nettles and brambles in its fortresses. It shall be a habitation of jackals, a courtyard for ostriches. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the jackals, and the wild goat shall bleat to its companion, and the night creature shall rest there and find for herself a place of rest. There the arrow snake shall make her nest and lay eggs and hatch and gather them under her shadow. There also shall the hawks be gathered, every one with her mate. So Edom is finally going to be paying for all the atrocities that they had committed in their history. Oftentimes people don't face immediate judgment for things, and oftentimes they feel like they've gotten away with it, or because they've been able through these atrocities to attack and conquer other people, that they're in the right. We need to understand that God doesn't work on man's timetable. All of those things that were seen regarding Edom and others is eventually going to catch up to them. And in God's time, he's going to bring about his judgment, and he's going to exercise justice on these nations who had abused others. The devastation that is portrayed here in these chapters is compared to that of Sodom and Gomorrah. Note how often Sodom and Gomorrah are used as representative of God's actions. And it's never good. It's never pretty. Because of the evil, they were destroyed. Well, Edom's actions are also portrayed as evil. And they're going to fall. They're going to go down as well. Now, in reality, this is dismal at best. But we also see that this is a fate that is going to be exercised or realized by anybody that rebels against God. So now let's look at verses 16 and 17 as we close out this chapter. And we see the phrase, seek the book of the Lord. Search from the book of the Lord and read. Not one of these shall fail. Not one shall lack her mate. For my mouth has commanded it, and his spirit has gathered them. He has cast the lot for them, and his hand has divided it among them with a measuring line. They shall possess it forever, from generation to generation they shall dwell in it. Well, Isaiah here seemed to anticipate that his message was going to be recorded for future generations. Then, others are going to be able to test the validity and the truthfulness of his prophecies. Remember in Deuteronomy chapter 18, where we have the prophecy of the great prophet. In that context, we see a test that is made for whether one is a true prophet or not. And it's not rocket science. If one is a true prophet, then what he prophesies is going to come about. A false prophet is one who prophesies something that does not come about. Well, here Isaiah is saying, test me. I'm going to be a test case. I am God's spokesman here. God is speaking through me. There is that prophetic emphasis again that it's God who's speaking through them and not their words. But future generations are going to look at this statement, and they're going to look at what happened to Edom, and they're going to see the validity and the truthfulness of the prophecies of God. Now, the Edomites suffered several invasions, but finally in the 4th century BC, they were defeated by the Nabateans. Survivors of that attack, of that conquest, basically settled in the southern area of Judah, and they became known as Idumea, Idumea at that time. Interestingly, Herod was an Idumean. So he was a descendant of the Edomites as well. Idumea is the Latinized form of the word Edom. Their coming to a complete end was finally realized when Rome took Palestine. That was in 70 AD where that was seen. Well, chapter 35, now we've seen this negative, harsh language being used, a terrible picture being painted of Edom, though it was self-inflicted, as with all the other nations. But here we're going to turn to a bright side. Chapter 35, the ransomed of the Lord are going to return. Well, having dealt with the judgment of Edom, Isaiah now turns to a beautiful poem or a hymn that depicts the redemption of the redeemed, of the remnant. Motyer in his commentary said this: no diagram can do justice to the subtlety of composition of this truly delightful poem. How fascinating to see that we run the gamut of emotions as we move through the book of Isaiah. It's harsh, then you see a message of hope. You see judgment, then you see redemption. You see God's people being carried away into captivity, and then the remnant is going to be brought back. So many different pictures are seen for us. But let's look at this beautiful chapter. First of all, verses 1 through 7 describes the blessings to come. The wilderness and the wasteland shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the excellence of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the excellency of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are fearful-hearted, be strong, do not fear. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For waters shall burst forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land a springs of water. In the habitation of jackals where each lay, there shall be grass with reeds and rushes. When you look at the regions that he's talking about here, these are all in southern Judah that are being addressed. This is the land through which Moses led the children in the Exodus from Egypt. For most of the year, you're looking at an area that was arid. There were rainy seasons and dry seasons that were seen. But during the rainy season, this area would basically transform into a lush garden to be seen. Reminds me of a waterfall that I saw when I was down in Chimala, Tanzania. It's called Kamani Falls. I was there in the dry season, and there was a trickle of water. There was a little bit of water falling in the waterfall, but I've also seen pictures of those falls during the rainy season, and it was amazing to see. And the transformation, how things became more green. You're looking at a very arid area during the dry season in Tanzania, and that's what's being depicted here. What had been seen before is dark, it's dreary. You see that arid, dried up area. But in the rainy season, that's going to be transformed. God's people were suffering. They suffered at the hands of Edom and other evil nations like her. But a change is coming. God's going to bless that remnant. Clyde Woods said this: man's world without God is a desolate wilderness. But just as spring rains bring the desert blooms to brilliant life, so the Lord's coming brings joy and hope to man's world. Great, positive, beautiful sentiment as it relates to God's people. The beauty of that revitalized nation is compared to Lebanon and Carmel and Sharon. Those were all regions that were known to be fertile and green and produced so many things that were pleasant. Natural responses to this news is going to be rejoicing and shouts of joy. They have something to be happy for because, again, God is going to bless his people. This scene is very symbolic of the changes that are brought when God blesses a region and his people. But when you look at verses 3 and 4, they were a people that needed encouragement. They had been through some very difficult times and some harsh circumstances. But in his own time, God's going to care for them. They're told not to fear. They're told not to get down. Cheer up. Look up. In God's time, he's going to come do these things. How is he going to bring this lush sense around again? How is he going to green things up, if we stay with the metaphor that he's using here of that arid area? He's going to bring vengeance and recompense. God's people are going to be vindicated, and he's also going to bring salvation. These are all powerful promises that are provided throughout Scripture. But you know, human nature is still to ask, how long? And that's what we see in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9. And there we're told the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, but he's long-suffering toward us. In his time, God is going to fulfill his promises. We just need to be confident and be patient and realize that all these things are going to occur in God's time. In verses 5 through 7, those verses clearly reveal that the time of these blessings is going to be in the Messianic age. How do we know that? Because of where this passage is quoted in the New Testament. For example, note the words used in Matthew chapter 11, verse 3. And this was in relation to John the Baptist. And the question was asked, are you the coming one? Or do we look for another? Very similar language there. That passage is quoted as to whether or not Jesus is the expected one. that is to come. And so in my mind, much more so than physical blessing being portrayed here, we can look ahead to messianic prophecies and see that spiritual blessings lie at the core, the foundation of what we're looking at here. And then let's look at verses 8 through 10 as we begin to close out our study. A highway shall be there and a road, and it shall be called the highway of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for others. Whoever walks the road, although a fool, shall not go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast go up on it. It shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there, and the ransomed of the Lord shall return, and come to Zion with singing, with everlasting joy on their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. There in verse 8, Isaiah talks about a highway. Not only will this desolate area be made lush and green and fruitful again, not only will that wasteland be transformed into something beneficial and productive, but also, he says, a highway of holiness will be constructed. A highway of holiness. Think about that. We're looking at holiness as a target, as a goal. And a highway, that's not a sheep trail. That's not a little caliche road out in the middle of nowhere in West Texas. This is a highway, unhindered access to holiness. A wide, easily traveled way is going to be built. Isaiah, in numerous places, has already referred to a highway to describe what kind of access we have to God. We've already seen it in chapter 11 and verse 16. We've seen it in chapter 19, verse 23. We're going to see it again in chapter 40 and verse 3. However, note, this highway will not be for the unclean. This highway will not be for the fool. This is talking about some kind of provision that God is going to give his people to bless them. In verses 9 and 10, the redeemed and the ransomed, that's two words talking about the same thing. It's synonyms. Redeemed in this verse is a noun that is used for the first time by Isaiah. Redeemed is what I mean. It's going to appear frequently in later chapters. Those that God has bought back, those that God has paid a price for, is who is being addressed. One form of this word, redeemed, is referred to as the next of kin who had the responsibility to intervene on behalf of his kinsman in difficult times. We find that addressed in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 25, and also Numbers chapter 5 and verse 8. A good case in point to remember there is the story of Ruth and Boaz. Boaz wanted to redeem Ruth, but there was another closer of kin who first had the responsibility and the opportunity to do so. And when presented with that, he refused, he declined, because he would have had to take on also financial responsibility. And Boaz did so and made Ruth his wife. The great story of what we refer to as the kinsman redeemer concept. Well, that's what's being spoken of here. God, however, is the redeemer, and his people are the redeemed. We are the redeemed today. We've been bought with a price, and that price was the blood of Christ. We are God's because he has paid the price for us. God is shown to be the only one here who can handle that responsibility. And then the word ransomed are those for whom the price has been paid for their redemption or their release. And what we see being portrayed there is a joyous result because of what God has done. Now we have just a few moments, and I want to begin to close out here. I want us to summarize now very quickly chapters 1 through 35, and then next week be prepared to move into that historical bridge of chapters 36 through 39. Chapter 35 closes this first section of Isaiah's prophecy. And within that section, there has been a lot of difficult language. There's been a lot of gloominess and darkness, judgment, penalty, sin, all of these things being addressed. And there have been their high spots. But it closes here with a powerful message of hope. You see, God has demonstrated his sovereignty over all the nations, and that's seen in the judgment that is coming. Whether or not they claimed to be his followers, they were still sovereign to him because of his role as creator and his very essence as God. He guided the people of Judah, but he also blessed and quite often punished the nations. It was shown to be imperative for kings and leaders to put their trust in God throughout all of these chapters. But chapters 36 through 39 give a historical demonstration of the wisdom of trusting in God, and is going to zero in on Hezekiah. As we close this out, we need to remember that this is just as applicable to us today as to anybody and any time. We need hope today. It's easy to get depressed when we see the nature of the world around us, when we see how far we have fallen morally, when we see the things that are shown to be acceptable, and even some requiring children of God to agree that their lifestyle is okay. We do live in difficult times morally as Christians, but we also need to understand that God's promises still extend to us. Revelation 2:10 says, "Be faithful until death, and I'll give you the crown of life." When are the scales going to be tipped? When is justice going to be seen? When God determines that it's time. For us, we need to be faithful. But our faithfulness is made much easier if we will take the hope that he has extended to us. Thank you again for joining us in this study. Until next time, God bless you.